Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Alan Calder. I'm half of your host for today on this webinar dealing with the requirements of cloud providers in respect of the General Data Protection Regulation. Tim Vincent, who's the Solution Engineering Team Lead for DataStax, is the other half of your team for today. Plan for today is, and I'm briefly introduce myself, Tim will do the same. I wrote a number of books around governance and protection of data. The original book I wrote on IT governance and implementing data protection management systems in compliance with ISO 27001 is now pushed on to its 6th edition, and that and many other titles around general data protection regulation, cybersecurity and so on can easily be obtained on any one of our websites. So some 15 years I've been involved in the intersection between board and governance on the one hand and implementation of cybersecurity on the other, and the General Data Protection Regulation brings the whole range of products and services that organizations need in order to address governance, risk and compliance to the point. Cyber resilience, in a sense, is the core strategy for demonstrating data protection compliance, because in order to avoid some of the challenges and penalties that come with GDPR-related breaches, you need to address the whole range of issues from data security through penetration testing, through PCI compliance, and so on. And IT Governance as a company delivers a set of services that start with books and documentation toolkits and expand to include software, consultancy, training both online and in the classroom, e-learning and so on. And we pride ourselves on being able to put together for clients whatever the right mix of products and services to help them address their specific set of issues. Today we're going to briefly overview GDPR. Those who are already familiar with it will recognize a number of the issues as we go through them. I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the privacy by design and privacy by default requirements of GDPR, which are new from a regulatory point of view. We'll look at the impact on cloud-based organizations. We'll touch on data subject rights, breach notification, and the effect that that's all likely to have on customer experience. We'll look at the technical and organizational measures that are applicable to cloud service providers, and then we'll have a brief look at the use of standards like ISO 27018 around what in standards language is called personally identifiable information. So under the GDPR, the data protection model looks a bit like this. It starts with us, that's you and me, we're data subjects, and we give our data to data controllers. That's an entity, can be a natural person, but typically a legal person who processes our data for one or more purposes. That processing can be outsourced to a third-party data processor, and if it is, then the obligations which the data controller enters into with the data subject are passed on, intended to be passed on contractually to the data processor. Data controllers can also both be based in third countries, but can also move data from the country in which it's collected outside their own country, and in fact outside the European Union or the European Economic Area. And there are specific requirements built into how that can be done legally, and those have significant importance for cloud-based processing. Third parties are also involved with data processing. They might be recipients of, they might be joint controllers. So DataStax and IT Governance, for instance, are joint controllers in respect of the information provided specifically for this webinar. And where third parties are operating, they too have obligations. The Information Commissioner becomes the supervisory authority for the United Kingdom. Each one of the 28 member states in the European Union has a lead supervisory authority who's responsible for ensuring that GDPR is implemented in that country. And I'm conscious that as I go through this, some of you may find that you have questions that you want to ask. So please do use the question function, which you'll see on the right-hand side in the GoToWebinar control stack. Do put questions in there, type them in, and then when we get to the webinar, and it'll be about in total between Tim and I 45 to 50 minutes, we'll deal with as many of the questions as we can. We'll read the questions out live, and then either Tim or I will provide you with an answer as the case may be. Those questions which we're unable to get to, we'll make sure we're answered, and what we typically do is provide a set of questions in an FAQ format 4 or 5 days after webinar. So one way or another, all of your questions will get answered either live today or in the form of a set of published FAQs. So GDPR is going to be implemented in the same way across the whole of the European Union. The logic of the structure is that there should be an equal playing field for data subjects. Their rights should be the same irrespective of which country they happen to be operating in or which country the data controller happens to be based in, and therefore the duties of the data controller should be the same irrespective of whether the company is based in Germany or France, Spain, the United Kingdom, or indeed outside the European Union and providing services into it. Supervisory authorities have significantly enhanced powers of assessment and enforcement, and the European Data Protection Board, which has been put in place, is the mechanism by which the behaviors of the regulatory authorities in each of the member states are kept in line so that there does in fact stay a level playing field across the whole of the European Union. Data subjects can make complaints to supervisory authorities. Data subjects can also bring actions. And the top 10 issues to pay attention to, if you're not already familiar with GDPR, start with the reality that fines are increased. So depending on where the breaches are, and for the most significant breaches, which will be to do with the 6 data protection principles, with the rights of data subjects, and with the extraterritorial or transported data flow requirements, the fines can be up to 4% of global turnover or 20 million euros, whichever is the higher. And the legal requirement is that administrative penalties, fines in other words, should be, as we say at the bottom of the slide, effective, proportionate and dissuasive. And we believe that dissuasive means that the statutory objective is that fines should be painful. So increased fines, that's the first issue. The second issue is that data subjects have the right to lodge a complaint to the supervisory authority. They have a right to seek redress if they think their rights have been infringed, and they have a right to damages for material and non-material harm. And bear in mind that non-material harm includes feelings of frustration and distress, and so as an organization, as a data controller, you need to be thinking about the possibility of disgruntled or upset customers or members of staff bringing actions at the same time as you worry about the possibility of administrative fines. The third key issue is there's a significant change in consent in the threshold that you can depend on for consent to data processing. Typically, and particularly in the UK, we rely quite a lot on consent as the legal basis for processing. From May next year, the 25th of May, when GDPR applies across the whole of the European Union, the threshold for consent is that it has to be proactive, it has to be given by a positive action, so consent by default is no longer going to be legal. But more importantly, consent has to be between 2 equal bodies in the sense that it can't be forced. So it will be close to impossible, for instance, for an employer to rely on consent to process the data of employees, because employees are not in an equal position. They can't freely give their consent, and invalid consent would invalidate the lawful basis of processing. So organizations need to be looking very carefully at the lawful basis for processing data. There are a number of lawful bases, including performance of contract, requirements of other regulatory instruments, and so on. Consent is not necessarily where you should be. If it is where you are, and obviously from a data subject's point of view, consent is great. Consent gives the right to withdraw consent, and that means that as a controller you have to make it as easy for a data subject to withdraw consent as it was for them to give consent. They have a right to be forgotten in respect of any data which you're holding about them, and they have a right to portability of data in respect of data which they've given to you. So the consent triggers those particular rights, as well as having a significantly higher threshold than under the Data Protection Directive. So third key area to focus on. The fourth is around breach notification. In the UK in particular, we rely on the fact that in the private sector, there's no compunction on us to report data breaches. The Information Commissioner encourages it, but there isn't a legal requirement. That changes from May next year. As a data controller, if you're breached, you've got 72 hours from the point at which you first become aware of it to report the breach. And if you have any experience of breach reporting, to assess and understand the incident in a way that enables you to meet the reporting requirements in just 72 hours is extremely challenging unless you've already put in place really effective methods of identifying what's happened and you know how to manage the breach response. If there is a high risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects as a result of the data breach, there is also the legal requirement that you notify the users of what has happened without delay and tell them what steps you're taking and what steps they should be taking to deal with the breach. You can avoid as a controller, the requirements to report a breach to the Information Commissioner if there is no risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. So for instance, if data is encrypted, then that's likely to be grounds that justify not reporting it. The fifth area of concern would be territorial scope, and territorial scope is that all organizations collecting data that are based in the European Union, if the organization itself is in the European Union, any data that it collects, irrespective of nationality or residence of the data subject, that data is subject to GDPR. So technically that means you could have data subjects in Australia, Sri Lanka, Uruguay, all of whom, if their data is being collected because they're obtaining services, internet services from European Union companies, they are entitled to the same protections as any EU citizen. Any organization based outside the European Union providing services into the European Union similarly has to be compliant with the GDPR and has to appoint a representative in the European Union. So territorial scope, significant change. Material scope is also a significant change in that personal data is now defined as including biometric, genetic, locational data, user identities. All of those have significant impacts for cloud-based organizations. The notion of joint liability between controllers and processors and joint controllers also comes into play. Data processors have a defined role where processing is outsourced to a third party. So as a controller, if you have a third party process your wages, your payroll bill, then that third party is a processor. It's got a legal definition, and it's legally only allowed to process data in line with the contract from the controller. And if a processor is breached, it has to, without delay, notify the controller. Data subjects have rights, and those rights are extensive. There are two new rights, the rights to data portability and the rights to be forgotten. And the data controller is required by law to facilitate the exercise of those rights. And that means transparency. It means ensuring that data subjects are notified of what their rights are at the point that you first collect their data, and that you make it easy for them to access information that you're holding and to exercise all of their rights. Data transfer is also very clearly dealt with in GDPR, the idea that the protections according to personal data in the European Union should accompany that data wherever it goes in the world. Those protections are not just technical or procedural security measures, but also legal measures in the form of protection enforcement of data subject rights. Those should stay with the data as it moves globally, and therefore there are restrictions on how data can be moved globally. And then finally, as I indicated, the European Data Protection Board ensures there's a level playing field across the whole of the European Union. It comes into force irrespective of Brexit on the 25th of May 2018. It comes into force by virtue of the existing European Union treaties, and in any case the UK government has indicated that the GDPR will be enforced, and in fact have gone further and said that rather than legislating around cybersecurity, they're going to put their support behind GDPR as a method of ensuring that the United Kingdom gets its act together around cybersecurity. A couple of key definitions then. Article 4 defines personal data, as you can see on the screen. It's a very wide definition. Virtually anything that enables a person to be identified is personal data, and the owner of that data, the individual, is entitled to that data being protected. Recital 30 talks very clearly, and this is important from the point of view of cloud-based services, that anything that enables someone to be identified, so online identifiers provided by devices, applications, tools and protocols, including IP addresses, cookie identifiers, RFI tags, that's all personal information, and that must all be protected in the same way as must names and addresses and anything else. So a very wide definition of personal data. And it's when you think about that wide definition of personal data and you start thinking about how do we protect data that you begin moving towards what Article 25 of GDPR talks about as being data protection by design and by default. And the objective of data protection by design and by default is that you should be able to demonstrate that you're complying with all 6 of the data protection principles. And the 6, there were 8 data protection principles in the Data Protection Act. 2 of them have come out. They both become separate chapters in the GDPR, and we're left with 6 much more clearly defined principles, which start with the requirement for lawful, fair and transparent processing. And if you're designing data protection, you're embedding it in how the organization operates, then you should be able to demonstrate for all personal data that you're processing that you're in compliance with the 6 data protection principles. You should be able to put in place appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect the data, and appropriate means you're going to need to do a risk assessment, because only you can determine what's appropriate for the volume of data that you're processing and the circumstances within which you're processing it. What you can't do is avoid the legal obligation to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures. You also need to make sure that only the data that you need to process for each specific purpose is what you're processing, and that implies carrying out what's called a Data Protection Impact Assessment, or DPIA. And carrying out a DPIA means you've got to look at for all of the personal data, and this typically applies to larger volumes of data rather than very small volumes. You'd be looking at processes where there's significant volumes of data being processed. The extent of the processing is fairly significant. You'd be looking at the period of storage and how accessible the data is, not just to users but also to the data subject itself. Data protection recognizes the concepts of pseudonymization and minimization as techniques for protecting data by default. If by default organization is pseudonymized, so information is pseudonymized, or if by default you collect only very small amounts of data inside the organization, then you're ensuring that you've got effective protection by default for the data. Privacy by design is a concept which has been developing for quite a long time. It finds its way into the GDPR. You can find its formal creation really in the work done by the International Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners, published back in 2010. You see on the screen, and the slides will go out to everybody, so if that's one of your questions, the answer is the slides will go out sometime later on this week. Privacy by design has 7 foundational principles, which start with the idea that data protection should be proactive, not reactive, that privacy, which means the rights and freedoms of natural persons, should be the default setting inside the organization. The starting point for organizations when dealing with personal data should be to worry about the rights and freedoms, the privacy of individuals, and therefore privacy should be embedded into the design of all processes and all software. Full functionality in systems should mean what's called positive sum, not zero sum, which means the net benefits for the organization of looking after privacy should be enhanced privacy for the individual, but also improved performance for the organization. Full life cycle protection, end-to-end, from the point at which you're collecting data from the data subject all through to the point at which you delete the data because it's no longer required. It should be secure right the way through that life cycle. There should be transparency for data subjects as to what's happening with their data. It should be clear to them. They should have all of the appropriate opt-outs and the ability to exercise their rights as and when they see fit. And organizations should respect user privacy in all aspects of what they do. And this says privacy by design should be applied across the applications, the technology the organization puts in place, the physical infrastructure in which its systems and applications run, and of course in its business practices. You can also think of privacy by design as being a set of steps which start off with defining what your data security requirements are, and they're typically the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information, looking at the workflow, how is the data being collected, what are the stages it's going through, and looking at the volume of data you're collecting, the variety of data, so name, address, personal identifiers, health data, whatever it might be, and the velocity with which the data is traveling through the system, and that should enable you to begin understanding the impact on the individual. And typically in terms of impact, you're looking at damage, physical, financial damage, distress they might suffer, and disruption to their life. And if you think about identity theft, you certainly get damage, distress, and significant disruption. So the impact of GDPR on cloud-based applications can be quite significant. The starting point in thinking of what you have to do is the starting point of what the difference between a controller and a processor is. And so you need to be aware of the GDPR definitions. A controller is the natural legal person that determines the purposes and means of processing of personal data, whereas a processor is the entity that processes personal data on behalf of controllers. Many software as a service providers are not necessarily going to be either controllers or providers or processors, in the same way that a software operating on the desktop, the software is not necessarily a processor, but the activity of defining whether you're a controller or processor is really going to be critical. As a processor, it's illegal for you to be processing other than with a contract from a controller, and you need to be carrying out what the controller tells you to do. If you're processing if you're providing services to children, you need to be aware of the fact that it's illegal or will be illegal for a child to consent to the processing of their personal data in respect of an information age service. That's typically online services, e-commerce services, online applications, social media sites, and so on. And a child is defined as being 16 years or younger, although it's a possibility that individual member states can define that anywhere between 13 and 16 in the light of their normal legal situation. That restriction on the rights of processing personal data doesn't affect any other rights that individuals may have. It only applies to the consent to the processing of personal data in respect of information age services. And that means if you're providing services that are likely to be purchased by children, you need to have in place methods for checking whether they are in a position to consent legally. Remember, if somebody's not in a position legally to consent, then any consent you've got will be invalid and the processing will be illegal. The implication of all of this is likely to mean that privacy notices, the means by which you ensure that data subjects know what's going on, becomes much more intrusive. Additional services can't necessarily assume consent, and there are many online services where when you log on you get access to 3, 4, 5, 10 other services which are available. They have access to cookie information. The data subject doesn't necessarily know what's going on. All of that's going to have to be thought through so that any organization that's providing services in that environment is able to demonstrate that it is processing lawfully. And remember the broad definition of personal information. Third-party processes will have to be clearly identified, that whether you're a controller or a processor, you've got to be really clear about that. And of course, big data activities, big data being the processing of large volumes of data, typically to arrive at profiles of individuals or target activities. There may be challenges in how those evolve because the requirements around the 6 data protection principles are applied just as much to big data as they are to any other service. So cloud-based applications, significant areas of work to be done. Cloud-based, one of the big benefits of a cloud-based service for many is of course the fact that hosting can be inexpensive because it can be moved around the world. You get significant resilience. However, the requirements of GDPR in Article 44 is the transfers of personal data by controllers or processors can only take place if the country to which it's going has been judged as having an adequate data protection regime by the European Commission, or if there are appropriate safeguards, which could be model contract clauses or binding corporate rules in place. And for cloud providers, therefore, again, this is a key risk area. Moving data illegally outside the European Union can attract the higher penalties. And that means at the very least, cloud providers need to ensure they can differentiate their service provision in a way that enables data subjects and controllers to be clear what data is kept inside the European Union and what moves outside of it. I did indicate briefly that a controller or processor based outside the European Union must establish a representative in the EU, and that must be a written representative, and that's an entity who, while not absolving the external controller or processor from its obligations, is able to be served notice or represent properly the controller inside the European Union. And that includes obviously to data subjects as well. And finally then, data subjects, the controller has to take appropriate steps to facilitate the exercise of data subjects. That starts with the provision in clear, transparent form of information about what the processing is for, and the rights to consent, to have access to rectification of incorrect data, to the erasure of data, to restrict processing while there's a discussion going on, or to object to data where to processing where the basis of processing is other than consent. In addition to that is the right to data portability, the right to lodge a complaint with a supervisory authority, and the right to be informed of any automated decision making, including profiling. So a significant set of rights, and the controller is required to take appropriate steps to facilitate the exercise of those rights, and that includes obviously organizations operating in the cloud. Whether you're a controller or processor, you need to be sure that you are facilitating this exercise of data subject rights. Processing, as I've said, has to be lawful. Data subject has to either give consent for specific purposes. There are circumstances under which consent is not required, so that, for instance, you can comply with legal obligations, deliver a contract, but as an organization, being really clear whether you're a controller or a processor, if you're a processor, you're processing subject to consent. If you're a controller, you have to have a lawful basis for processing, which means that if you don't have, you potentially are processing data illegally. Clearly identified obligations, clear obligation on processors to operate under a legally binding contract, and for controllers and processors only a month to respond to subject access requests. Really touched on consent, and this slide summarizes what I've been saying. Particularly worthwhile bearing in mind that special categories of data, which include health, biometric, genetic type of data, race, religion, that type of data can only be processed with explicit consent, and that means that if you're processing that data, you need to be really clear about the basis on which you're doing so. Otherwise, it's prohibited to process it. Article 5 then says all processing must be secure against accidental loss or damage, and if there is accidental loss or damage or deliberate loss or damage, then you've got that 72 hours within which to report to the Information Commissioner. Processors report to controllers, controllers report to the Information Commissioner, and if you can't report within 72 hours, then you need to explain why you couldn't. So obviously inadequate systems and processes mean that you might not be able to report in time. When you do get to report, you would imagine the fines are going to be higher because you should have known that you had 72 hours to report and should have put in place appropriate steps to deal with it. Penetration testing, a logical thing for all organizations to be doing, making sure that the vectors through which you could be attacked are properly controlled. Key part of making sure that you're able to deal with what you're doing. Processors have to make sure that all of the things they're doing, they have a very clear contract that sets out what they've got to do, that you're taking appropriate security measures, you're assisting controllers to achieve compliance with the requirements, and that that's built into all of the organizational processes and activities of the organization, summarized into what we call a privacy compliance framework. And a privacy compliance framework links your policies, procedures, controls and records with the 6 data protection principles and the governance, risk and compliance mechanisms you put in place to ensure that GDPR is embedded in the organization. What the Information Commissioner calls the principle of accountability is solidly embedded. One set of controls that cloud companies can draw on, specifically designed for the cloud, is the Cloud Controls Matrix. You can download this from the CSA website. It covers all of the kinds of areas that you might need and can be used alongside ISO 27001. And GDPR provides for the use of certifications and certification standards for organizations to demonstrate compliance with the requirements of GDPR. It also recognizes that national standards like Cyber Essentials in the United Kingdom, BS 10012, ISO 27001, or ISO 27018, which is for the protection of PII in the cloud, are all methods that organizations can use to demonstrate they've put in place appropriate administrative measures to protect data. So that's the program, the procedural, the legislative components of GDPR, and I'm going to hand you over now to Tim Vincent, who's the Solution Engineering Team Lead at DataStax, to talk you through how DataStax can help address some of those specific issues in the GDPR compliance environment. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you. Yes, so my name is Tim Vincent. I'm Solution Engineering Team Lead here at DataStax. My career has predominantly been in databases and data management. I started at Informix, which was acquired by IBM. Was then at Oracle for a number of years, and for the last 3 years I've been here at DataStax. So what does DataStax do? So DataStax effectively powers cloud-based applications with a database management layer underneath cloud applications. So the type of applications where you see DataStax being used are shown on the screen here. So Customer 360, personalization, fraud detection, inventory management, recommendation engines, identity management, supply chain. But important for this conversation here is around security. So what we see in cloud-based applications is these typical characteristics where DataStax targets. So cloud applications are contextual. You need to, in terms of recommendation engines and personalization, they need to be a personalized experience. They need to be always on today. So, so customers, when they're accessing cloud-based applications, they need a 24/7 response time, always on. They need to be real time. In a cloud-based application world, slow is effectively down. If you're having to wait for an application to respond, you will move on and go to the competitor's application. Cloud-based applications need to be distributed. You need to be able to access the data from anywhere on the planet. They need to be at global scale. They also need to be scalable. So you need to be able to easily scale your cloud-based application as your customer base increases. So specifically in financial services, DataStax is seen in a number of use cases. So we're seen in Customer 360 use cases, master data management, customer profile management, authentication, personalization, anti-fraud, payments and transactions, risk reporting, market data capture. So all these applications and these use cases have those cloud-based application characteristics. And here are some of the logos that we can mention where DataStax is underpinning these financial services applications for our customers. So DataStax, the DataStax product is DSE, DataStax Enterprise, and it's built on the industry's best NoSQL database, which is Apache Cassandra. What we do is we take the best version of Apache Cassandra and then we add extra features and functionality around Apache Cassandra that enables it to be easy to build and effortless to scale. The type of functionality that we put on top and inside of Apache Cassandra is things around analytics, around search, and around graph. We also provide a visual management tool called Ops Center, a visual development tool called DataStax Studio, and then we provide all the connectivity that you need to connect your application to this cloud-based ready distributed database through our drivers. So the two main topics that I want to highlight in the next few minutes. The first one is the features within the product, the features within DSE that enable you to get further down the road with regards to your GDPR readiness. And then the second topic I want to look at is how DataStax DSE Graph can actually help you create a single view of your customer. So you may have a number of legacy systems where the users exist inside these legacy systems, but if you need to erase that customer's data, how do you get a single view of all the customer detail records that you hold within your organization? So with regards to GDPR, we see the requirements in terms of on the data management side falling into these three buckets. So assessment, preventative, and detective. In the area of assessment, we can help here at DataStax with regards to offering our professional services capability. We have a number of professional services packages that address different areas of your development and production lifecycle. This one here that I'm highlighting is called our DevOps Primer, and what we do is we'll spend a week with you drilling into your application with a particular focus around validating the security configuration that you have on your DSE deployment. So we can work together with you using our expertise that we've gained from working with multiple financial services customers in ensuring that your platform is secure and is GDPR ready. So in the area of preventative, so there's a number of articles which Alan has highlighted that demand particular requirements of your data management platform. So in the area of access control, this is where we are strong when compared to our competitors in this space. So we have done a lot of enhancements into the product that make DSE enterprise ready in terms of security. So we have both internal and external authentication. So you can give authorization via the grant and revoke type syntax that a lot of people will be very familiar with within the traditional database world, where you can grant certain permissions to certain users. We also have the ability to do external authentication. So if you're already using Kerberos or LDAP to manage your users, we can easily hook in to those authentication systems, so to be able to provide you single sign-on to all your data within your DSE environment. GDPR also refers to finer grain access control, and we have finer grain access control into DSE. So we have row-level access control inside DSE. So this gives you the ability to secure data within individual tables down at the row level, all handled via CQL, which is our SQL equivalent, if you know the traditional database world. So as well as providing a secure view of data within a single table, this can also enable multi-tenancy capabilities on the Cassandra tables within your cloud-based environment. So if you are hosting multiple tenants within your cloud-based application, we can segregate the data between the different users of the system. Encryption requirements, Alan has highlighted a number of these. These are referenced in Article 32 and 34. So DSE has transparent data encryption. We have that in two areas. We have data encryption in flight. So this is in flight between the client, so between the client and the node. In this case, the node could be a cloud instance, a cloud machine, so between the client application and the database platform itself, fully encrypted, and also the movement of data between the cloud instances or between the nodes within the environment. That's also fully encrypted. We also encrypt data at rest, so this includes all the data files, all the redo log information, anything associated with the data within your application is fully encrypted at rest. And the good thing is there's no application changes needed at all to enable this level of encryption. In the area of detective, this is focusing on the GDPR requirements around auditing, so taken from Article 30 and Article 33. So I was expecting the slide to advance. Here we go. So in the area of data auditing, out of the box, DSE provides auditing, so the ability to track who did what and when against which data within your environment. So we will track select statements, update statements, delete statements, creation of users, deletion of users, and then all this information is then either logged onto a secure file system or it's logged within tables within your DSE environment. And then from these tables you can then generate reports that will give you an indication of whether any data breaches have been made. Article 17 talks about the right to erasure or the right to be deleted. So built into DSE is what we call time to live, or TTL. So you can set on down at the table level an expiry date for the users within your system. So maybe there's a particular requirement to say, okay, if the user hasn't updated their account within 3 months, we'll automatically delete their data. or if there's a particular time limit that you need to set for your users. That's extremely easy to be done with inside DSE, DataStax Enterprise. Big thing around data sovereignty from Article 56, certainly with regards to cloud-based applications. Now, out of the box, you can easily manage data sovereignty with DSE through its multi-data center architecture. So you can have a single cluster consisting of multiple data centers, and you can control in which data center the particular data resides. So maybe you have different availability zones from Amazon, for example, and you need just European data to exist within European availability zones and US data to exist within US availability zones. That can be easily done within DSE by controlling which data exists in which data center. This also will enable you to do more hybrid type architectures. So you could have one data center that is actually on premise, which is securely locked down, and then you can then control the other data center, and the data that reside in that other data center may then be in a cloud provider. You can also create hybrid type architectures between different cloud vendors. So you could have one data center within AWS and another data center within Azure, just for example. So, so these are the main features of DSE that fulfill some of the GDPR requirements around assessment, preventative, and detective. What I wanted to talk about now is just briefly how DataStax can help with existing legacy systems. So you may have data in multiple places within your organization. DataStax has, as part of its platform, we have DataStax Enterprise Graph. So perhaps you have customer B who has credit cards with you and has bank accounts. You also have customer A who has insurance policies with you and different types of bank accounts. How do you know within the organization that customer A is actually customer B? And if you need to take some action on that customer, for example, around the rights to erasure, you need to delete all of that customer information. You need to know internally that customer A is actually customer B. So when I delete that one customer, I need to delete all of those accounts within all the different systems and accounts that the particular customer has. So this is where DSE Graph comes in. It gives you the ability to be able to link and determine that customer A is actually customer B. And to do this, what you're effectively doing is creating a customer 360. So a single view of your customer, a single view of your users. So all the various legacy systems that you have, all the various data centers, or rather data sources that you have, would then feed into one DataStax Enterprise cluster, which is running DSE Graph. This will then give you this single view of all your customers, will enable you to spot trends and patterns, as well as manage the individual users. So, so in a nutshell, DSE, DataStax Enterprise, enables you to get GDPR ready if you're using DSE internally, or if you're looking for a distributed, always-on, no single point of failure database for cloud applications. But it also helps you if you have legacy systems where you're looking to create a single customer 360 view of your users and assets. So that's it from me. Back over to Alan.
So thank you, Tim. We've got time for a few questions, so we're not going to just leave you to pick up when we send out the slides. You can get through to both the DataStax and the IT governance websites, where there are a range of appropriate products and services. There's obviously the IT governance training and books and manuals and toolkits. There is the DataStax application, there's IT governance consultancy, but let me begin addressing some of the questions. There are, not surprisingly in a sense, the bulk of questions tend to cover both the DataStax application, but from a legal perspective. So in the 10 or 12 minutes we've got left, I'm going to pick up some of the more obvious or more interesting questions on GDPR. I'll just share the question with you and then tell you what the answer is, and we'll make sure we get out, as I said, a consolidated list in FAQ format of questions and answers towards the end of this week. So what happens with respect to GDPR and data protection in general post-Brexit is that GDPR will have been in force. The law came into force in May last year. It will apply from May next year, 25th of May, in all member states, includes the UK. Post-Brexit, the UK government has said that as all European Union law is intended to become part of British law, it will continue to apply in the UK. Of course, those of you who think about transport data flows will have noticed that when Britain leaves the European Union, it will be outside the European Union and probably outside the European Economic Area, which means that it will be illegal for data to flow from the European Union to Britain unless Britain has a adequacy finding, and it means that UK companies providing services into the European Union will need to appoint a representative inside the European Union. We're assuming that GDPR will continue for a substantial period, many years post-Brexit, because having a data protection regime which meets the requirements of the European Commission is an essential step to having an adequacy finding. So we think this will continue. A data transfer is not well defined. Could you elaborate on that? Also, what is large-scale processing? A data transfer is, if you bear in mind that processing is defined as virtually anything that might happen to data. So processing doesn't just include stuff that you do with data in a system, but it includes viewing it, organizing it, accessing it. And that means that somebody who, even on a thin client in India, can see information which is collected in the European Union is processing information, and therefore the rules about data transfer will apply. It's apparently possible for the data to be accessed from outside the European Union. You need to make sure that you have in place appropriate rules to protect that data. Because obviously if you can access data, you can write it down, you can photograph information on a screen, and if you're putting that data into an area that doesn't provide adequate protections for rights and freedoms of natural persons, you're breaking the law. So transfer is anything because processing is anything. Large scale is not defined in GDPR, but guidance so far from the Information Commissioner suggests that it's likely to involve, it's going to be proportional to the rest of the processing you do, but it's likely to be a number of data subjects measured in the thousands, maybe in the tens of thousands. We do expect more clear guidance to emerge. Large scale is particularly important in terms of the requirements around DPIAs, and so over the course of the next 14 months you need to be paying attention both to the Information Commissioner website, and we're planning to launch an update service in the next week or 10 days from IT Governance that will have those kind of links and so on available in them. I'm going to pass, if you don't mind, on PSD2, the Payment Services Directive 2. There are clear links between GDPR and PSD2, but not everybody in this webinar is PSD2 oriented. Consent must be by positive action. That means not by default. It means that, and GDPR is clear, it can be by ticking a box, it can be by changing browser settings, it can be doing anything which is a clear and positive indication of an agreement to a set of terms. If they're consenting, it has to be clear what they're consenting to. So you need to provide all of the information and say, when you click here or do that, you will be consenting to the following things. Bear in mind that if you're relying on consent, consent must be granular. You can't wrap together half a dozen different things knowing that the data subject won't necessarily like one or two of them and ask them to consent at the same time to all of them. They have to be able to consent to each and every processing of each and every data item or collection of data in a way that gives them control over what's happening. How does the right to be forgotten work? If we're required to keep data to ensure the user is excluded from any lists that are bought from third parties. So it is technically a complex area, particularly as there is no central method as there is for telephone preference service and so on, where an email address can be registered as being somebody for whom you're not processing. So as we understand it, there is an area here where you have to process data in the sense that you have to keep a record of people who've said do not email me or do not contact me, and you have to protect that information that you're processing even though you're legally not meant to be processing it, because it's the only practical way you can ensure you don't do what data subjects want you to do. So there is a limited form of retaining data subject to a regulatory requirement in order for you to meet that regulatory requirement, which gives you the lawful basis for processing information that enables you to demonstrate that you have forgotten somebody or you are meeting their requirements to not process their data. Consent and parental consent, which came up for one of you, if consent is the age of 14 in one member state and is the age of 13 in another member state, and the data subject and his or her parents move from state to state, then what was legal could become illegal. And the practical issue, first of all, is that when something is done in accordance with the law, it can't then become illegal later on, either because the law changes or because somebody moves. So the processing that took place will still have been legal. Any further processing will have to be based, we imagine, on, this is our reading of the law, there is no formal guidance, will have to be based on where the data subject is now residing. So they could have given consent in one country where 16 was the legal age of consent for an information service, move to another where it's 14, and in that new country, new processing will need to be approved by an appropriate adult. 72-hour breach, can you clarify what level of breach requires notification? So the law is very clear. It says any breach that involves risks to the rights and freedoms of natural persons must be reported. If there is no risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons, then you don't need to report it, which in effect means that the onus is on you, the data controller, to decide whether or not there is a risk and to report it. In practical terms, what we think that means is that at a gross level, and on this the Information Commissioner is clear, if data is encrypted, then there is no risk to the rights and freedoms, you don't need to report it. If there is a small volume of data, possibly you won't need to report it, but that's a judgment that individual organizations are going to have to make. We imagine that fairly quickly Information Commissioner or supervisory authorities will give guidance as to what they think should be reported, on account of the fact that otherwise they're going to be overwhelmed. One of the current problems when trying to resolve data issues with large multinationals is the lack of response for engagement. Will GDPR force better engagement? Yes is the answer. It certainly should. The clear target from our perspective of the requirements on non-EEA companies to appoint representatives in the European Union, and the extent very clearly of the territorial scope to include those organizations means that organizations outside the European Union can expect to find themselves pursued through European courts for breaches of GDPR. And you just have to have a look at the European Commission's track record. It's certainly not shied away from pursuing in antitrust legislation major companies from outside the EEA, and we're certain as we can be without having anything useful in the way of a crystal ball that the same thing will apply. So yes, we would expect to see a much greater responsiveness from large international organizations. 4% of their global turnover is a significant cost to them. What is acceptable encryption? The current international standard is FIPS 124, so you just simply follow what Information Commission has published as being a current level of acceptable encryption, and that will tell you what you can do. I can't, a number of you have left, and so we're down to, I think, our last questions. ID theft. How will GDPR actually prevent theft of identity? From my perspective, theft is an incremental activity that builds profiles of targets and then exploited through account takeover. That's absolutely correct. GDPR doesn't prevent ID theft. It doesn't prevent any nefarious thing. What GDPR does is it applies a set of requirements to data controllers and processors to process data and to protect it in ways that should prevent it from being stolen, should prevent it from being accessed illegally, and where it is accessed illegally and the protections that controllers have put in place are inadequate, punishes the controllers with very significant fines and requires controllers to notify data subjects quickly so they can take avoiding action to deal with the consequences for them. And that avoiding action could, of course, include being required to provide compensation. So criminality will continue, breaches will continue, the onus is on organizations to reduce the impact on data subjects by taking action to protect and preserve the rights and freedoms of natural persons. And that brings us right to the end of the time we have allocated. So, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of both Tim and I, IT Governance and DataStax, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I know that IT Governance has a series of other webinars on related subjects planned over the course of the next few weeks, and as I've said, you can, through the websites of both IT Governance and DataStax, find more information about how we can help you challenge this regulation, which will apply. There will be no transition period because we're already in it from the 25th of May next year. Thank you all very much for being with us, and have a good rest of Tuesday. Bye-bye.